Good morning, and thanks again for inviting me to speak today. I really want to thank the conference organizers and the conference committee, particularly Bob, John, and Tom. Today I'm going to talk about Henslowe, Alleyn, Burbage, and Shakespeare, and staging the myth. I was inspired to talk about this when I saw a couple of productions of plays about Shakespeare in Boston this spring. And each of these plays featured three key players: Philip Henslowe, Edward Alleyn, and Richard Burbage. And these individuals were considered to be people that made significant contributions to what we know about Shakespeare. But what I'd like to talk about today is what do we actually know and how do we know it? What do we know about these three players? How does the portrayal of them as individuals impact the perception of Shakespeare? And how can our research into the authorship question help us explode the mythology? You know, can the study of extant documents help us as scholars and educators sort out fact from fiction? That's the purpose of my current research, looking at the circulation of manuscripts in Elizabethan England to help us determine the relationship between Edward de Vere and his circle of writers, and to understand the Elizabethan theater and Shakespeare's place in it. I believe we first should deconstruct the fabrications of the orthodox scholarship and examine the existing evidence. So to start with Philip Henslowe, there are no extant portraits of Henslowe. This is Geoffrey Rush in Tom Stoppard's 1998 film Shakespeare in Love. But what we do know about Henslowe is that he was born circa 1550 in Linfield, Sussex. His father was master of the game in Ashton Forest. He was apprenticed to a dyer, Henry Woodward, and when Woodward died, Philip married his master's wife in 1579, and the wealth that he accumulated from acquiring that business allowed him to purchase the property on which the Little Rose stood. He then developed some gaming and entertainment establishments on that property and partnered with John Cholmondeley, a grocer, to finance the construction of the Rose Theater. In 1592, Henslowe was appointed groom of the chamber to Queen Elizabeth, and his diary was acquired from his brother John. And he began recording matters related to his theatrical dealings in 1591 or 1592. The latest entry in the diary is 1609, but most of the activity ceases in 1604. In 1615, several players filed a suit against Henslowe, complaining that they were mistreated, and he died in 1616. He's earned a reputation as someone who exploited his actors, keeping them in debt, but some scholars, particularly R.A. Folks, note that this was common practice, that theater owners, were charging interest for the players, and were acting as bankers for them. So it's interesting to note that most of this reputation of Henslowe's stems from not just the lawsuit, but a quote that he made that we can find at the Dulwich College, where I went. And as we know from Alan Nelson's Monstrous Adversary, quotes can be distorted, misinterpreted, and repeated until they become taken as fact. Henslowe wrote, "Should these fellows come out of my debt, I shall have no rule over them." Here is a portrait of Edward Alleyn. This is at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. This one has established provenance, and the signet ring is another indication that it's authentic. And what we know about Alleyn is that he was born September 1st, 1566 in Bishopsgate. His father, a London innkeeper, hospital administrator, and porter to Queen Elizabeth, died in 1570 when he was just 4. His mother remarried twice, and by 1583, he was touring with the Earl of Worcester's men In 1589, he was already touring as a member of the Earl of Eagan-Donovan. Sorry, and in 1589, he was working as a servant for the Lord Admiral, and he and his brother purchased playbooks, instruments, and costumes for the Lord Admiral's men. By 1592, he was acting for both the Lord Admiral's men and the Lord Strange's men at the Rose. In August 92, he partnered with Henslowe to run the company, and in October 1592, he married Henslowe's daughter, Joan. By 1594, he was known as the leading actor in the company, famous for his portrayals of Marlowe's characters, Tamburlaine, Faustus, and Barabbas. And in 1597, at the relatively young age of 31, he retired from the stage and focused on business investments and political alliances. And his memorandum book documents his activities from the period from 1617 to 1622. And next we have Burbage. This portrait is at the Dulwich Picture Gallery as well. It was thought by some to be a self-portrait, but in fact has been identified only as early 17th century British school artist unknown. He was born in 1567. His father, James Burbage, most of us know, built the theatre, the first public theatre in London, which opened in 1576. He and his brother Cuthbert followed in their father's footsteps, apprenticing in the theatre. He joined the Lord Chamberlain's men, and in 1594 became a shareholder in the company. He went on to become the troupe's lead actor, starring in productions of Richard III, Hamlet, Lear, Othello, and he was known for his realism. His style of acting has often been compared to a method actor, very different, than Ned Allen's kind of over-the-top delivery. When his father, Burbage, died in 1597, Richard and his brother took over the family business, and lawsuits led to the sale of Blackfriars. In 1598, the theater was dismantled. The timbers were moved to a new location on the south side of the Thames and reassembled into the Globe. Burbage was also said to be an accomplished painter who designed an impressa for the Earl of Rutland. Now, this is another painting at Dulwich, the head of a woman, which was attributed to Burbage, and in fact was later identified as a work by a northern Italian artist. So what's interesting to note here is kind of the circular reasoning that this was attributed to Burbage, and that was part of the basis for the other portrait being thought of as a self-portrait, both of which have been disproven. So when you're looking at art, it's quite similar, as Bonner noted, to when you're looking at manuscripts, we have to question these identifications, often later misproven. The fourth player, of course, is Shakespeare. And here we have Joseph Fiennes from Stoppard's 1998 film, which was the winner of 7 Academy Awards. So again, these modern stage plays, Stoppard's Shakespeare in Love, and the other one that I saw, Lauren Gunderson's Book of Will, imagine these theater impresarios as instrumental to our understanding of Shakespeare's career, from his breakout success in public productions to the compilation and printing of the First Folio, which of course is what the Book of Will is about. The plays in question are both really well written. The playwrights are talented and lauded, and this lends credibility to the stories that they've written. Both playwrights use excerpts from the plays, as well as plots and characters from the canon to craft their stories. In Stoppard's play, he makes several references to Oxford as Shakespeare, in my opinion, having read it and seen it several times, including nods to Don Quixote, performances of the plays for the Queen, and the tongue-in-cheek titles like Romeo and Ethel, the Pirate's Daughter. The setting of the play, London, summer 1593, further suggests that the playwright is well aware of the significance of this year and the name Shakespeare. Stoppard's other Shakespeare-related play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, is literally bursting with parodies of the references to scientific discoveries and the humanist philosophy of the Renaissance in Hamlet. In an interview with the Buenos Aires Shakespeare Festival earlier this year, Stoppard was asked what one question would he ask Shakespeare if he had the chance. And he immediately replied, "Who wrote it?" And he laughed, and then he backpedaled immediately, and he said, "That was a flippant remark. It never crosses my mind to doubt that William Shakespeare was there." In the BU College of Fine Arts production that I saw, excellent student production, Alleyn was played by Sam Regueros as a flamboyant star, a brilliant director, much more knowledgeable about stagecraft than Will, Henslowe, or Burbage. He's a prima donna, but he's earned it. Burbage and Henslowe are played as arch enemies with their respective troops fighting like Montagues and Capulets. I'm assuming many of you have perhaps seen the film, but as the play opens, Henslowe is in debt, and he offers his financier a new play by Will Shakespeare and a share in the theater. Henslowe complains that his theater is closed due to the play. His company is forced to play in inn-yards, while Burbage's men play at court, including early works by Shakespeare. Will Shakespeare asks Henslowe if he can borrow £50 to buy a share in the Chamberlain's men. Henslowe's account books at Dulwich record many debts owed by Shakespeare's contemporaries. Will plays Henslowe and Burbage off one another, double-dealing both of them. Burbage is portrayed as clever in this play, and Henslowe as something of a dupe. Henslowe is focused on money and commercial viability, and when confronted by one of his creditors about the closing of the theater due to the plague, he quips, "Let me explain about the theater business. The natural condition is one of insurmountable obstacles on the road to imminent disaster." This is reflected in Edward de Vere's experience in the 1590s, as detailed by Alexander Waugh in his paper 1591, A Watershed Year. It's also reflected in many of the letters that I looked at the British Library from Edward de Vere about his financial condition during that time period. Shakespeare in Love Again, set in 1593, includes a performance of two gentlemen at court, but we know that Titus and Gisippus was played at Whitehall for the Queen in 1577. So could this be another hint that Stoppard is well aware of the parallel story? It's a brilliant mashup of Elizabethan history, Romeo and Juliet, and Twelfth Night, where Stoppard introduces Viola, who dresses as a boy to play the part of Romeo, falls madly in love with Will, and is slyly reminiscent, to my mind, of Amelia Bassano-Ladere. Stoppard may have been influenced by his friendship with John Mortimer, the screenwriter for Brideshead Revisited, Rumpel of the Bailey, and the 1978 British TV series, Will Shakespeare, starring Tim Curry, which I recently saw thanks to James. Stoppard's play is actually great fun. It's full of witty puns that Oxford would have loved. When asked who is giving a pep talk to the actors at a rehearsal, Henslowe says, "Nobody, the author." This line marks the entrance of the real star, Ned Alleyn. He arrives with his company, swashbuckling and flamboyant, brandishing a sword, and says, "Huzzah, the admiral's men are returned." And then he says to the financier, "Silence, dog, I am Hieronymo, I am Tamburlaine, I am Faustus, I am Barabas, and yes, Master Will, I am Henry VI." Will writes the play on the set, not unlike the great auteur, Jean-Luc Godard. He makes it up as he goes along. And Burbage discovers that Will has sold the play, given the play to Henslowe. There's a brawl between the two companies, and the theater is closed by the master of the revels for allowing a woman to perform on stage. The players drown their sorrows at the tavern. Burbage crashes in with his men looking for a fight. Ned, who's drunk, challenges him. But then, to everyone's surprise, Burbage offers Will, Henslowe, and the admiral's men the curtain to perform their play. And this is reflected in Henslowe's diary. In the end of the film, the curtain is packed with patrons, including wealthy nobles slumming incognito. That's Stoppard's line, which I thought was interesting. They have no Juliet, Sam's voice is cracked. Viola knows the part by heart, so she plays the role. Henslowe and Burbage are resigned to the fact that they'll be arrested for, again, allowing a woman to perform on stage, but the audience goes wild, it's a hit, and Master of the Rebels shows up, accuses Viola of being a woman, and the Queen saves the day. She tells Tilney, I know something of a woman in a man's profession. Then she invites Shakespeare to visit her at Greenwich, tells Viola to ask him to write something more cheerful next time for Twelfth Night. So Stoppard's play reimagines Shakespeare, but includes many subtle references to the authorship question and many, I think, kind of puns and hints that he's aware of the authorship question. In the opening scenes, there's a coffee mug from Stratford-upon-Avon on his bookshelf while he's practicing scribbling his name. In contrast, Lauren Gunderson's Book of Will is much more a traditional Stratfordian approach to the topic. She is one of the most produced playwrights in America since 2015. She's a two-time winner of the Steinberg ATCA New Play Award, a winner of the Lanford Wilson Award, and a finalist for the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize. She lives in San Francisco, and she's currently working on some musicals. In the Book of Will, Shakespeare has just died, and his fellow players are lamenting his death, and Burbage is portrayed as a seasoned lion of the stage, famous across England, loud and proud. This is the production that I saw, the Lyric Stage Company of Boston. Again, very entertaining, very well done. But the Book of Will follows the Stratford logic, largely as detailed by Emma Smith in her book, The Making of Shakespeare's First Folio. Published in 2015 by the Bodleian Library, by Oxford University Professor Smith, it refers several times to Hemming and Condell as signatories and explains that Shakespeare wrote his characters based on the actors and then constructed plays around those characters. She is the professor of Shakespeare Studies at Hertford College, which is where I had my tea when I visited last year. She writes, as long-standing sharers in the company, they presumably had access to the scripts and the authority to negotiate. Now, she doesn't offer any real evidence for that, but she admits as much. She's honest, as Shelley said, to a certain extent. She says, however, the extent of their involvement needs some investigation. They never claim to be editors. They have no experience in play publication or literature. And she also tells us that Condell's will, of course, didn't mention any books. But in typical Stratfordian circular logic, she states that the only evidence of their involvement in the folio is the folio itself, where they appear as signatories and self-appointed curators. Smith notes that Burbage is listed under the heading, the principal actors in all these plays in the folio after Shakespeare, even though she calls Burbage, the actor for whom Shakespeare wrote all his major roles, Hamlet, Macbeth, Antony, Othello. It never occurs to her that the name Shakespeare may have been added after the fact, displacing Burbage. Similarly, she says Burbage was a celebrity, but in Johnson's 1598, Every Man in His Humor, again, the name Shakespeare appears at the head of the list. She never questions the placement and its authenticity. Here is the page from the folio. And here are, the two pieces allegedly written by Hemmings and Condell, where she elaborates on the roles of these two players, which again is what the premise of the play Book of Will is about, saying that the publishers needed to negotiate with the King's men who held the manuscript copies, probably at the Globe or the Blackfriars Theater. And she concludes that clearly Hemming and Condell, she says Hemming without an S, were vitally important to the First Folio project, since they were the connection between the publication and the theater. Without them, there was no access to the unpublished material. This is the plot of the Book of Will, And these are images from the Bodleian copy that Smith used, and these are available online. You'll note, if you look closely, that the spellings are different in each, at the bottom of each of those pages, and that they are clearly not signatures. In a kind of ironic twist, at the end of the play, when the book is completed, the team, Hemmings and Condell, bring the book to Stratford to show it to Anne. And Anne says, would you read it to me, please? And she says, Susanna will read the women's parts. So these are the mythological versions of the story. But what can we find out by looking at the actual documents that exist? For example, at Dulwich, where I went last August, thanks to the SOF, and the recommendation of Alexander Waugh. He suggested that there were some documents there that might be worth looking at. The college founded by Edward Alleyn was originally called Alleyn's College of God's Gift, and there I had the assistance of the archivist, Mrs. Callista Lucy. She was wonderful, you know, again, bringing me the catalogs and telling me her theories about who wrote what. And you know, Alleyn was, again, very well known. It was Nash who wrote that, you know, not even Roscius, the greatest actor of ancient Rome, could ever perform more in action than the famous Ned Alleyn. Now, the manuscript pages that follow are used with the kind permission of the governors of Dulwich College and may not be photographed or otherwise reproduced. So I would ask that you please refrain from taking photos of the manuscripts. You won't be able to see any detail, but they're all online, they're digitized. So everyone can go to the Dulwich College Henslowe Alleyn digitization project page and see the documents. Let's see, it's located a few blocks from the college is the picture gallery, which again houses an important collection of portraits, and I do plan to return to the gallery on my next visit. I'm indebted again to Professor Don Ostrowski, who wrote the book, Who Wrote That?, for his inspiration in my search for the evidence of Edward de Vere as the author of the Shakespeare canon. In his class at Harvard, Ostrowski emphasized the importance of focusing on primary source documents in order to understand history. But as we know, even primary source evidence must be verified for authenticity, and the collections at Dulwich are especially problematic. The diary itself is referred to on the Dulwich Archive site as a treasure trove of information about the Elizabethan theater. It contains the records of payments to dramatists, loans to authors, actors, disbursements for costumes and playhouse construction, payments to the masters of the revels, and daily performance receipts for the Rose Playhouse. Henslowe's diary is a folio of 242 leaves. It's missing 4 pages. 4 pages are blank, but it's missing a lot of pieces. It's, again, considered one of the most important documents of the time period regarding the Elizabethan theater. During my visit, one of the documents that I saw was this manuscript 7 and folio 90 recto, which is about, let's see, a bond between Henslowe and the dramatist George Chapman. This was written on October 24th, 1598, for a personal loan of £10, 10 shillings. The signature is thought to be authentic. It's Chapman's signature there and has been compared to others that we've seen before. But one of the difficulties about looking at these signatures and looking at these documents that Folks, again, R.A. Folks in his 1961 book, Henslowe's Diary, noted was that Henslowe often signed his actors' names himself. So even Henslowe wasn't above signing other people's names in the book. So it's very difficult to determine which hands are authentic and which are not. One of the people who figures in this time period, obviously, particularly the Rose, was Christopher Marlowe, because his plays were the ones being produced early on at the Rose. Alleyn was famous for his portrayals of Marlowe's leads, but there are no records at Dulwich of payments to Marlowe or loans to him. What can we infer from the fact that his name is missing from the record? There's also, the fact that Mrs. Lucy noted that there was no correspondence when Marlowe died between Alleyn and Henslowe. Now, she suggests that perhaps that's because they were still working together every day, he hadn't retired yet, so there wouldn't be a need for a letter. But did Marlowe have debts? And if so, where's the record of them? When they have been written off when he died? Those are some of the questions I had. Looking for Kit Marlowe, we can find at Dulwich this particular document, which is considered to be a forgery by Collier. In George Warner in the catalog, says that it's in a later, perhaps modern hand. You can see that it is relatively modern. And if we can look for comparison at the alleged foul sheet from the massacre at Paris, this is reproduced from the Folger website. And this, as you can see here, is said to be presumably the handwriting of the author, but recent scholars have considered this a reconstruction by another hand. And finally, this particular signature of Marlowe's is thought to be authentic. It's from the National Archives. It's his signature on a will from 1585, where he and his father were witnesses to the last will and testament of Catherine Benson. So even just trying to find a signature from Marlowe that's authentic is not an easy task. Here is an example of Henslowe's answer to a petition regarding Thomas Lodge's debt. Henslowe's signature is distinctive and relatively consistent across time periods. But as I said, he did take the liberty of signing the names of his own actors, oftentimes in the diary. Let's see, what else we have here? Here is a letter from Henslowe to Alleyn on the death of Gabriel Spencer. When Johnson murdered Spencer, they did have a letter, but that was in 1598, again, when Alleyn had retired to Dulwich. And again, you can see his distinctive signature there. For comparison, here is a poem said to be in Ben Jonson's hand, and it is quite a different hand. So on Alexander Waugh's recommendation, the document that I spent the most time looking at was the manuscript for Orlando Furioso. Robert Greene was accused in an anonymous work called The Defense of Coney Catching of having sold his play, Orlando Furioso, first to the Queen's Players, and then when they were touring the country, selling it again to the Admiral's men. And this is depicted in Shakespeare in Love. The play appears once in the earliest list of performances in Henslowe's diary. This is manuscript 7, page 007. And this was played at the Rose by the Lord Strange's men in February 1591-92. At the time, it seems that the Lord Strange's men and the Lord Admiral's men had formed one company and then split into two separate companies in 1594, when Alleyn became kind of the star actor of the Admiral's men. Now, the sides for Alleyn's role as the lead character are said to be the only extant document of its type from the Elizabethan theater period. The annotations and interlineations are thought to be by Alleyn, and that was what I was trying to determine in looking at it. The part of Orlando is written on probably strips of paper that are like 16 by 6 inches. Originally, there were probably 14 strips pasted together to form a continuous roll, like Jack Kerouac's manuscript for On the Road, right? If anyone's ever seen that, it's pretty cool. But they were separated, and 3 are now lost. Now, according to R.A. Folks, the text of the part was written out by a scribe who had some difficulty reading the manuscript from which he was copying. So again, we're kind of trying to imagine what happened here. And sometimes he got things wrong. Occasionally he left a blank space where he couldn't read or understand a word. And Folks says, it seems that Alleyn himself supplied the words where necessary. There are a few stage directions, and the word exeunt was added twice by Alleyn. But the Orlando Furioso manuscript does, in fact, include quite a bit of marginalia as well as additions, and again, many of these are thought to have been made by Edward Alleyn. For example, the Latin stage instructions, again, are thought to be Alleyn's. The surviving strips preserve 531 lines, or parts of lines, and the completed part would have run about 800 lines. Now, again, thought to be, there are medieval plays sides available for us to view, but this is thought to be the only one for the Elizabethan period. And Alexander Waugh has written that the entire 531 lines, or argues that the entire 531 lines were written by Alleyn, and that this was the basis for Green's Grossworth of Wit calling the upstart crow, he's referring to Green. This is what, Alexander has determined from looking at the document himself. And I thought that was really interesting because, Alleyn's hand is distinctive. You can take a look at that here. Here's his book, his memorandum book. And in my own observations, there's Alleyn's signature. There are at least 2 different hands in the Orlando Furioso sides. So it is possible that Alleyn, as an auteur, dictated the lines to the scribe and then made additional notations. The idea of Ned Alleyn as an auteur writing or rewriting his own lines and directing the other actors really, makes sense. It's portrayed that way in Stoppard's play. And I think it's also a better explanation for what Smith calls Burbage's importance as Shakespeare's collaborator. I don't think she means as a writer. He probably just did some improv too and ad-libbing to make the roles his own. So how many hands are involved in the Orlando Furioso sides? That is debatable. I certainly understand Alexander's argument, and I would love to discuss this with him more. But there are still, as I said, some problems with this manuscript. I think it's interesting to note that Burbage isn't mentioned. Of course, he's in a rival company, so maybe that's not surprising, but there is no mention of him. Even though he, in addition to his lead role in many of Shakespeare's plays, he appeared in plays by Kidd, Johnson, Webster, Beaumont, and Fletcher. The volume comprising Henslowe's diary began to be borrowed from the library in the 18th and 19th centuries, and this is where we encounter some problems, particularly with Collier, who decided really basically to use the opportunity to commence a series of literary fabrications, including a letter into which he inserted Shakespeare's name. So unfortunately, the manuscript has suffered quite a bit of mutilation. Several groups of signatures have been cut out of the diary by subsequent readers and then found their ways to other collections. They are available at the British Library, the Bodleian Library, the Folger, and Belvoir Castle. In some cases, entire pages have been removed. So while Henslowe's diary has been called the single greatest illuminator of the history of English Renaissance theater, the authors also agree that it's likely we'll never know the extent of the diary, and absolute verification of all its entries seems unlikely. In addition to the Orlando Furioso manuscript, I looked at documents pertaining to his property dealings, Alleyn's property dealings around Fisher's Folly. Here is an image of a theater sketch by Henslowe from a letter in 1593, and Henslowe's diary does figure significantly in the discovery of the ruins of the Rose in 1988. The accounts of the expenditures in 1592 for the expansion led to, as I said, the discovery of that property, and since then, in 2008, archaeologists affiliated with the Museum of London discovered the foundations of what they believed to be the theater on the site of Holywell Priory. And this was, again, showing how the area was remodeled by James Burbage. And in 2012, the remains of the Curtain Theatre were uncovered, which of course we know opened in 1577. This was discovered behind a pub in Shoreditch, and these are the places that I am interested in going to look at next. This is the focus of my research, searching for additional documentation of Oxford circles, the origins of modern theatre, and documents at the Dulwich Archive include work by or references to several members of Oxford's circle: Robert Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Anthony Munday, Thomas Nash, Thomas Lodge, George Chapman, Henry Chettle, Ben Jonson, and many others. So my question still is, how can we use this extensive collection to help us learn more about Oxford's debt and his involvement in the world of theatre in the 1590s? Again, Alexander has done extensive research into the question. I am indebted to him for both his research and for his recommendation to go and look at this collection. And he's concluded that the financial crisis which befell Oxford in 1591 led directly to the rise of Burbage, Henslowe, and Alleyn, beginning in 1592. He notes that the control of the playwrights shifted from Oxford to the common players, such as the Burbages, Henslowe, and Alleyn, and that Henslowe and Alleyn, the upstart crow, raided the archives of the plays that belonged to the Queen's men in the 1580s, taking works by Greene, Marlowe, Kidd, Lodge, and others, debasing their texts and presenting them at the Rose, the Swan, and the Newington Butts. But my question is, where are the references to Shakespeare? He's nowhere to be found in what is considered the most important collection documenting Elizabethan theatre. There are references only to the plays themselves. The mutilation of the documents and the forgeries are evidence that early scholars were desperate to insert him into the existing record. And the inclusion of the name Shakespeare on the lists of players so often alluded to by Emma Smith and other Stratfordians must be questioned and cannot be taken at face value. The perpetuation of the Stratford myth is pervasive in media, with the most recent entry, Kenneth Branagh's film, All Is True. If we accept the evidence put forward by Alexander Waugh that 1591 marked the end of Oxford's reign as Phoebus, the central figure in the world of Elizabethan theatre, then perhaps it's not surprising that the subsequent theatrical records, specifically those at Dulwich College archives, include no evidence of Shakespeare. Thank you.